We are here to examine equity in America. I'm Olivier Knox, Senior National Correspondent at U.S. News. Day 5. I've got a great panel for you today. I've got George Askew, President and CEO of the Meyer Foundation. I have Jennifer Jones Austin, CEO and Executive Director, Federation of Protestant Welfare Agencies. I have Robert Gordon, who is President Biden's Deputy Assistant for Economic Mobility. And I've got Sheena Strom, President and CEO at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. So the pandemic, the 2020 pandemic, really put a spotlight on a lot of things that we already knew existed. We already knew that a lot of Americans were living paycheck to paycheck. We already knew that there were wide disparities in access to health, wide disparities in access to education. These were not new phenomena, but they certainly were exacerbated by SARS-CoV-2. I'm going to play into a bit of a stereotype about journalists. We like to point to the house that burned down, not the houses that didn't. And in the spirit of that, I want to ask my panelists, as they look across the landscape of equity in America or disparities in America, where is the system blinking red? What are the most urgent or most severe things that they see as they look across this country? And I'm going to start with Jennifer.
All right. Well, when I think about where is the system blinking red, I first have to think about what that means. Like, where are we in crisis? And what jumps out at me is that we have to first clarify what system we're talking about, right? If we're talking about the system of inequity, it's not in crisis. What is that line? It's functioning just the way it was designed to function. It's actually not in crisis. Now, if we're talking about the system that has been constructed to combat and address inequity, yes, it's very much in crisis. And we can look to the weakening of legislation. We can look to Supreme Court decisions. We can look to various actions by influencers to see how efforts aimed at ensuring voting rights, privacy rights, affirmative action supports, education integration and opportunity, how all of that has been weakened and to the point of being eroded. For me, I think the greatest concern that we should have in this moment is that the one attempt that was not legislated to address the core of inequity, the framework, the structural foundation, DEI, is very much under attack. Martin Luther King Jr., when he declared on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial that he had a dream, a vision that one day his children would live in a nation where they would not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. When I think about that statement, I think that he was essentially speaking of a structural reset, of a framework that centered on belonging and inclusion. He was setting up a new paradigm, a new way of thinking, a societal shift for the nation. That was a structural reset, and that itself is now very much under attack and is being eroded. One of the things that is underway right now in New York City, something that I'm very proud of, back in 2021, in the throes of the aftermath of the George Floyd killing, Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery as well, and in the continuing throes of the pandemic and what we were seeing with respect to disproportionate impact upon persons of color throughout the nation, then Mayor Bill de Blasio stood up the New York City Racial Justice Commission, the first of its kind in the nation, that was charged with going into the New York City Charter, the Constitution, to look at how structural racism and inequity was embedded in core government functioning. What he recognized and appreciated was that this was not a one-to-one, this wasn't just happening, but government had enabled it. And frankly, since the beginning of the founding of this nation, with the taking of land from Native Americans, structural racism and other isms were embedded in our core government functioning. And he charged a commission, a Charter Revision Commission, which I was privileged to chair, with the responsibility of going into the city's constitution to acknowledge the harms that had resulted from structural racism embedded in core government functioning and to reset the foundation. I raise that because when you say, is the system blinking, where is the system blinking red? It's in the fact that we have yet to address the structural foundation of racism and other isms and biases that pervade this nation and even this world. And so that's where it's blinking. If you don't do the structural work, it doesn't matter what systems you put in place, because as the General Counsel for Bishop Desmond Tutu with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission told me when I first began the racial justice work, Jennifer, remember that those who created the system created it to persist. So unless you are constantly at that game of trying to undo the structures that uphold the system, you're not really going to get anywhere.
Same question. Let's go with Shayna this time.
Sure. So when I think about where the system is blinking red, I really think about the fact that over the past 4 decades, the United States has experienced rapid inequality. According to one estimate, between 1979 and 2019, the bottom 90% of individuals lost 9% of their share of national income. That's a huge transfer of income from lower income people and working people to those at the top. And that's had real effects. A child born in 1940 had a 90% chance of being able to earn more than their parents by the time that they were 30 years old. A child born in 1980 had only 50% chance of being able to do the same. You know, that's a problem in its own right, but it's also a problem because it affects our ability as a country to have strong, stable, and broad-based economic growth. You know, that happens for a lot of different reasons, but for example, a more equitable society enables people to be able to develop the skills that enable them to be productive, thriving members of society and improve our economy. And that's why we've seen in recent decades that the times when inequality has been highest, average economic growth has been lower, and the times when economic growth has been, when inequality has been falling, average economic growth has been higher. So really, like, I think that inequality itself is something that we should be really concerned about, and is really something we need to work on as a society if we want strong, stable, and broad-based economic growth.
George, what is your perspective?
So I would certainly have to agree with what Jennifer said, and that the root causes of the inequities in our country are built into the system, and so you have to have systems change in order to make any improvements at all. For us in philanthropy, what we saw, and I'll harken back to 2020 when with the racial uprisings and then the advent of the pandemic, we saw a great deal of resources that were infused into communities that we were deeply concerned about, communities of color, poor communities. Without systems change. So, you know, I sat in a very different seat during the pandemic. I was running the pandemic response in a large county here, Prince George's County, Maryland, and there was this idea that folks were surprised that Black and brown people were dying at a greater rate during the pandemic, as if that was not what would be expected. The same forces and the same material conditions under which people were living did not change as a result of the pandemic. They were just highlighted and heightened. And my concern, and what I'm seeing now, is that as soon as the pandemic began to wane and things began to get better, we were going to go back to business as usual. And that's where we're kind of headed back to, business as usual. So even in the world of philanthropy, there were lots of folks who made significant investments in Black and brown organizations, in systems change work. And now with the advent of the SCOTUS decisions, with the pandemic waning, people are backing away and becoming, and I think in some respects, fearful of making those investments. And so what we're seeing in our community of folks that we fund is that they're losing funders. All of this infusion of money that they had to actually do systems change work is disappearing, and they're on a cliff that's fast. And that cliff of funding is fast approaching. And so who is it that we fund? At Admire, years ago, during a strategic planning effort, looking at how to address poverty, lots of conversations were held with the community here in Washington, D.C. We fund in Washington, D.C., Maryland, and Northern Virginia. And what became clear was that you couldn't address poverty without addressing the root cause of poverty, which was racism. And the way to change those root causes was through systems change. And systems change through funding folks who are building power and building movements through advocacy, base building, organizing. And so we fund organizations in the greater Washington region that are working at the root cause level of systems change in order to work through a racial equity and racial justice lens to end the disparities. 400 years of disparities are not going to disappear overnight. This is long-range work. And so we're going to continue to do that work, and we're going to continue to encourage our colleagues not to back away, not to be fearful.
So let's get the perspective from 1600 Pennsylvania.
Thanks, Olivier, and thanks for having me. I agree with George, it can't be business as usual. And I think we have in this country for a long time profound gaps in access to the building blocks of the American dream and of America's promise: a good job, good education, a home, healthcare, safe community. And those gaps cut along racial lines for the kinds of reasons Jennifer talked about. They also increasingly cut along lines of education and geography for some of the reasons that Shana talked about. And we have to tackle those gaps head on with all the force of a great nation. And I think you see that in, I'm not going to do everything from 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, but I'll do a couple things. You see that in measures large and small. So in economics, we talk about an investment agenda in manufacturing and core sectors of the economy, and massive, massive investments, public investments of a kind the country has not seen in decades. Core to that agenda is the creation of more jobs for people who do not have college degrees. Core. And we've seen over $1 trillion in public and private investment, 800,000 more manufacturing jobs, which I think a decade ago people would have thought was impossible. And with all of that work, investments in training, in childcare, in transportation, so that those jobs get to people who will not otherwise see them across lines of race, education, geography. That's the big thing. And then I don't want to call it small, but equity is a profound focus in this administration in everything we do. And there are a million examples I could give. I just thought I would bring three. Think about the fact that finally, because investments in the American Rescue Plan and beyond, we are going to get rid of every lead pipe that goes into homes in this country, finally. We have made massive investments in simplifying the process of accessing benefits, which has racial dimensions. You know, an agency like FEMA in a disaster historically, like how fast do people get benefits? Well, it varies. And along what lines does it vary? You can guess. And that is it's about a lot of little things. And you gotta recognize them and tackle them head on. So things like eliminating documentation requirements, simplifying processing, makes a huge, huge difference. So those are a few examples. I could give more, but it is a core focus in everything that we do.
George, I want to drill down a little bit on a phrase you used, business as usual. It is notable that after the ramp up of pandemic-related benefits, they've now been mostly unwound, right? And we have child tax credits going away. We have a return to the purging of Medicare and Medicaid rolls in the millions, right? Mm-hmm. Talk to me about business as usual, about this return to business as usual. We have these persistent disparities in opportunities and outcomes. Help me unwind that a little bit. What does that mean? What is business as usual? What are the things that most keep the system where it is?
I'll talk about it from my perspective in philanthropy. And so one of the reasons that we made the shift years ago from being more of a traditional philanthropy, which is funding direct service in many cases. Many philanthropies just fund direct services, which are great and which is needed. Someone needs to be fed, we want them fed. Someone needs to be housed, we want them housed. but this creates a perpetual cycle of what I call comfortable poverty, so that in philanthropy, we can maintain a system of this comfortable poverty. So again, you feed someone one year, next year they come back because we haven't fundamentally changed the underlying system that leads to people being food insecure. We haven't fundamentally changed the underlying systems that lead to people being housing insecure. And so our approach to not business as usual is to get, again, at the root causes of these disparities. And so when I say business as usual, I'm essentially saying that we're continuing to have this a repeating cycle of fix something at its surface level, but not fixing it at its root cause. And so it will just come back to where you were when whatever problem you're addressing in the moment will still be there when that moment is gone, unless you've changed the underlying forces that are creating the disparity.
If I could just jump in there.
Yeah, of course.
Commend George for what he's doing at the Meyer Foundation, because he's in the very, very, very small minority when it comes to foundations that are actually centering on structural change, centering on root causes. The fact of the matter is that we have to ask philanthropy, we have to ask government, we have to ask business, we have to ask the nonprofit community. Are you in the business of managing poverty or working towards the eradication of poverty? And if these different sectors and pillars are honest, it's really managing poverty. The Meyer Foundation is in the minority, the very small minority.
And I should have made it clear at the top that while I direct some of these questions to an individual panelist, you guys are all welcome to jump in. So Eric alluded to this in his opening remarks, but we at US News love data. Love it. It informs us, it challenges us, it makes us think. And so I want to ask Shana, when we talk about examining equity in America, what are some of the data points that you think we should be keeping in mind?
Sure. Well, just to center this from where I'm coming from, so the Washington Center for Equitable Growth is a nonprofit research and grant-making organization that works on the relationship between equity and economic growth. So I'm really going to focus on the places that are about equity in the economy, because that's our space. The short answer is that the news on equity and labor force participation is fairly good. The news on equity and wealth is not good. So in terms of labor force, so women's prime age labor force participation is at its highest point on record, beating a mark that was set in April of 2024 by 0.7 percentage points. The tight labor market has pushed the male-female wage gap to its lowest level on record at around 11 cents. Black prime age employment to population ratio exceeded its 1999 peak. The Latino prime age employment ratio exceeded its pre-pandemic high. And Black and Latino workers have seen faster wage growth than other groups. While real wages have been fairly steady for white Americans since the beginning of the pandemic, there have been robust gains for both Black and Latino workers. So that's really good news. Again, from the wealth side, I think what we're seeing is not as good. There are still huge racial wealth gaps. Despite solid gains by lower income households during the pandemic, the share of wealth held by Black households actually decreased to 3.4%. It was 4.4% before the pandemic. Latino wealth remained unchanged, and generally racial wealth gaps are quite sticky. So a lot of work to do on the wealth gap side.
Thanks for that. Robert, I'm going to put you in the hot seat a little bit. We have now a U.S. Federal Court of Appeals ruling against the Fearless Fund, part of a broader picture of legal assaults on DEI. How do you see, not you, but how does the administration see both that ruling and the broader campaign against these kinds of programs?
I mean, the administration believes in inclusion and believes that we have a long way to go to achieve the country's promise of equal opportunity. And there's a lot of programs and a lot of efforts that have been undertaken to realize that promise over decades and have made progress. And we have very conservative courts that have taken a stand against a lot of this work. And I'm not going to speak to the particulars of that litigation, but I think in general, it is very unfortunate the role that the courts are playing in getting in the way of efforts to realize the country's promise of having an economy and a democracy that include everyone and work for everyone.
Obviously, I come to this from the perspective of a politics and policy reporter inside the Beltway. I realize your job is not electoral politics, but as I speak to veterans of Democratic campaigns who are looking at this president's appeal to black and brown voters, one thing comes back again and again and again, which is housing and access to affordable housing. And one of the people I spoke to recently said that it is important from both a policy and a political perspective that this administration unveils some kind of significant program between now and November. So I got to ask you, are you going to unveil something sizable between now and November? I'm not asking you about the campaign. I am asking you this from the perspective of policy, but obviously the two are intertwined. The politics and policy are intertwined.
I was chatting with my son last night about this event, and I described some of the president's accomplishments that I was going to talk about here around jobs, and he said, I never hear about any of that stuff. And so, Olivier, we have a big housing plan, and I appreciate everyone may not know about it, but housing is a huge challenge in this country. It is a challenge driven by a decades-long process of not building enough and not having adequate supply. We talked about the pandemic. Everyone thought in the pandemic we would see a surge in homelessness, and we did not. And it was a huge accomplishment, and it was not an accident, and it was because of massive investments, including large investments in the American Rescue Plan, which the president drove, and unfortunately not a single member of the other party voted for, in emergency rental assistance. 8 or 9 million families were assisted, millions of evictions prevented. So moving forward, what do we need to do? We need a dramatic expansion in the supply of housing to drive more affordability. We actually have made real progress. Last year, 1.7 million units were built, I think the largest number on record. But we have a plan to build 2 million more. And it requires sort of an all-hands-on-deck approach, resources, incentives, promotion of action at the state and local level. I do want to close on housing with one point about equity, which is those are measures that are important for everyone, but we got to pay attention to making sure there's an expansion also in affordable housing and access to affordable housing. So the administration has supported significant expansions in access to vouchers, Section 8, continue to propose that. And we've proposed measures that will improve access to home ownership, particularly for people of color. So a big challenge has been the appraisal gap, the fact that the same house, if there's a black homeowner, it's going to be appraised at a lower value. And that's on average, not everyone, but on average. And that has real consequences for the ability to buy a home and the ability to build wealth. And it has been a focus of the administration to drive down that appraisal gap. It's actually down about 40% recently, and that is not an accident. So lots to do on increasing housing supply.
Just want to chime in and state what is probably obvious or should be obvious is that we have to continually examine these issues intersectionally. And we cannot talk about housing and affordable housing in America without talking about wages and wealth. And I'm going to bring it back to your data point. We have to make sure that when we're examining data, we're not just looking at surface level data, but we're unpacking it. So while the unemployment rates are historically low, and especially for persons of color, black persons, and while we may see wage growth, we still have significant occupation segregation. We still have a situation where white males are, segregated in higher paying jobs and roles than are black men, and how that contributes to your ability to afford safe, and quality level housing. So we can't look at this as just, we just need more affordable housing. How does this play out in terms of wage disparity, wage inequity?
So how do you tackle occupation segregation?
That's a huge issue. Well, first of all, it begins with when black and brown persons enter jobs that have historically been, held mainly by white males. We often see that there's a drop in the salaries when you see more black and brown people going into those roles. So you have to control against that. Again, you have to also begin with what is what is a set minimum wage? We still have in this nation a federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour. That's $15,000 annually. Not many people can live, one person, let alone one person. So you have to look at all these issues intersectionally and then come up with a plan that resets the foundation. And if you want, I can tell you what I think that looks like.
I do. I want to hear it. Come on.
Well, I'll go right there.
You're up here because we want to hear from you.
Well, if you're ready for me, be careful what you ask for. You just might get it. So we've been talking about the root causes of the challenges of inequity. And one of the things that the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, under the leadership of Martin Luther King Jr., leaned into, and I'm going to go back to 1963 to the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. People like to think it was just about voting rights. It was just about access to places of public accommodation. That March on Washington was the March on Washington for jobs and freedom. They were as much centered on economic justice as they were on other civil rights. The root cause, as Martin Luther King wrote about, my father, who was a member of the team with Martin Luther King, and others have written about, the root cause of racism, gender, other isms, and biases in America is structural economic deprivation. That's it in a nutshell. Money and power, structural economic deprivation. And still today, when you have a federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour that sets the bar, the minimum threshold for America, and then you have a federal poverty level, the official poverty measure that says that a family of four living anywhere in America needs just $30,000 to technically not be considered poor. When you take two adults and you annualize the federal minimum wage, $15,000 for one, $30,000 for two. Lo and behold, if you've got two adults in a household with two children, technically they're not poor. That is structural economic deprivation. What this nation needs, and what I'm centered on right now, along with a growing coalition of national leaders, is a national true cost of living measure. A true cost of living measure that takes into account what you need, not only to get by, day to day, but what you need to get by, get ahead, and plan for tomorrow. Just yesterday, Bloomberg News released the results of a poll that I, along with several others, commissioned that takes a look at what Americans are saying, not just low-income Americans, but middle-income Americans. 65% of those classified as middle income are saying they are struggling financially. Better than 50% are saying at 500% of poverty, that's $150,000 for a family of four, they're saying they don't know if they can plan for tomorrow. What we have done in our society, what we have allowed for, is structural economic deprivation. If you set the official poverty measure at $30,000 for a family of four, two adults and two children, and then you build eligibility for critical income supports off of that, you know that you are leaving many people going without. When you set a poverty measure that doesn't account for what you need to save for a rainy day, what you need for retirement, what you need to plan for your children's future, then you know that you've stood up structural economic deprivation. You know that those who have will continue to have, and you know that those who don't will never have an opportunity. So we need a national true cost of living measure to begin to change how we look at what it means to achieve economic security in this nation. So it's not just reserved for those who already have, but those who don't can have a chance.
Thank you. George, I could feel you wanting to jump in a couple times, and so I'm going to invite you.
Well,
now
it's hard to follow that because I can't disagree with any of that. But maybe I'll just pick up on what it reminded me of, is that and I'll get back to your data question again. I don't know how popular this will be at U.S. News and World Report where data is. While data,
we're not here to make friends.
While data is critical, the storytelling to accompany that data is, I think, equally critical for, at least for us, and at least in the industry that I am. It helps people to retain those numbers, to help them to humanize the data. One of the things I always try to remind myself of when looking at data, when looking at numbers, is that behind each of those numbers is a person, is a family, is a community, and you have to be able to raise that narrative in a way that brings the data to life, because we can talk about what it means to live off of $15,000 a year, but you need to be able to see the faces of a family that's trying to make do on what we consider to be the minimum that makes you not poor, or the minimum that makes you a viable family in this sort of American dream.
I'm going to invite you all now to pile on me. Starting with Robert, because you sort of alluded to this in one of your answers. What is the mainstream news media getting wrong about equity in America?
I mean, I talked about the fact that I think this administration has a very bold and specific agenda that, in all the noise, gets lost. And I just want to pick up on Jennifer's incredibly eloquent plea around a better measure of the cost of living, and just remind everyone, this goes back to the conversation about the pandemic. Part of what we did in 2021 was finally enact a fully refundable child tax credit that, because of that and because of other economic relief that was enacted, again, with 0 votes from the other party, we cut the child poverty rate in the United States in half. We cut the child poverty rate in half, the lowest in history for Black Americans, for Latino Americans. This was a game that people didn't think was possible. I want to say it's a tribute, philanthropy activists, people who worked for this kind of measure of support for low-income families, that it happened. And then, unfortunately, we weren't able to sustain it. We didn't have the votes. And to my mind, and I know for this president, some of the great unfinished work of these last few years is expanding access to core supports for families who are doing everything that we ask of them. And so that means a fully refundable child tax credit. It means expanding access to child care, which is wildly unaffordable for millions of people, and that can be worth thousands of dollars in families' pockets. It means providing universal preschool. It means providing paid family leave. These are measures within our reach that would dramatically change the daily lives of millions and millions of Americans. So I wish that got a little more attention.
Shayna, what are we doing wrong?
Well, I do have to pick up on Robert's point and just say, I couldn't agree more that investments in the care economy are they're absolutely huge to have an impact both on inequality and on economic growth. I would just add, this is less what the media does wrong and more just noting something that hasn't been mentioned yet in this panel, which is unions, and that the right to organize has a huge impact on people's ability to earn more, to have a say in the workplace, and it has a huge impact on wage gaps. People of color in particular both earn significantly more if they're part of a union, and also it helps to decrease the wage gaps that I spoke about. So I would really want to emphasize the importance of that. The other thing I would just reference is, there's a really important upcoming debate that is going to have a huge impact on all of the equity issues we're talking about, and that is the expiration of some of the provisions of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. I think, having enough revenue in the system to be able to provide some of these important social supports that Robert has been talking about is extremely crucial. And really, some of the provisions of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the evidence shows that they really did not trickle down to working people in society. They really helped only sort of the wealthiest individuals in society and corporations. So it's really important as that debate moves forward that all of those provisions not allowed to expire, are not retained.
I have a thought.
Really?
Narrative.
Please.
Narrative shift. The media significantly controls what people think and believe. And how news is reported or how we talk about the issues, how the media talks about the issues, sets up how people then think and move about. And in our nation, when we talk about people with the lowest income, dare we even begin to talk about them having savings and beginning to build assets and wealth? It's like a taboo. But what we know in this nation is that if you have wealth, any level, any modicum of wealth, that helps you to get by. We saw during the pandemic, the infusion of cash was to help people weather the economic storm. If you had savings, you could weather the economic storm. But we live in a society where you can't access certain basic income supports, the care economy, if you have certain savings in the bank. So if I have very little income and I hit a bump in the road, and I have no savings to get me through, everything falls apart. So we have to change the narrative. Should we be centering on helping low-income people just, get by? Or how do we help low-income people build some base level of wealth to weather economic storms? And I believe that the media can help shift the conversation about that and make it okay. We will never worry about Jeff Bezos's kids not having income because they have wealth.
And can I just quickly add to that? And this is not where the media is getting it wrong. I think this may be a place where we're across multiple sectors we get it wrong when we're talking about equity, and we continue to confuse equal with equitable.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Equal is giving everybody the same thing. Equitable means giving folks what they need to be successful. And until we understand and utilize that distinction to the favor of the folks who need things to be equitable, not just equal, we're going to continue to spin our wheels.
The merciless clock is ticking down. I have 3 minutes remaining for what unfortunately was initially conceived as a very broad question. So I'm going to ask you all to keep it very brief out of respect for the next events. Obviously, the policy responses are a patchwork of local, state, federal, philanthropic efforts. George, what's working? What's one thing that's working?
In the philanthropic community, we've seen across the nation pilots around guaranteed basic income, but essentially giving folks money unattached to any particular return. And we see that folks use that money to improve their lives, improve their health, improve their housing. They spend it well. They know how to spend it. We just need to get it into their hands. That's something that but the philanthropic community can't do it. We don't have the resources to take it to scale, but certainly government could.
Jennifer, what's working?
I think increasing focus on structural change. There's a lot being written, a lot of research that is helping us to appreciate that policies and programs are critically important. But if we don't look at the structural underpinnings and work to develop systemic responses to that, and so I think that that's working. Greater attention being paid to the structural underpinnings of all of these isms and injustices.
Robert, what's working?
I'm with George on the importance of researching the gains from delivering income to people. It's mattered to the child tax credit, and the work going around in the country is really interesting and important. I just want to add also, I think philanthropy helps the government spend effectively by figuring out the smartest ways to invest. It does matter whether you use a good approach to job training or a not so good, or a good approach to preschool or a not so good. And there's limited resources in the federal government to do that philanthropy tends to have a lot of wonks in it who care about things like this, and it helps us in government also.
Shayna, same question to you. What's working?
Other than the things I've said so far, I would note Social Security. A lot of people don't know that it's one of the most effective anti-poverty programs around, has dramatically cut elderly poverty, and I think it's something we need to continue to protect and preserve.
All right, George, Jennifer, Robert, Shayna, thank you all for taking part in this. Thank you for all of your expertise in the matter and your willingness to share it with this group. Thanks so much.
Thank you.